Well, I'll go ahead and get us started with housekeeping stuff. So, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Welcome to the Collaborative Science for Estuary series. This is Nick Sobral with the Science Collaborative. Today's session, we're talking through a project that's a multi-reserve catalyst project that connected 5 reserves with a common interest in better integrating conventional and indigenous knowledge sources and management practices. As you can see at the cameras, we have 3 folks from that project team joining us today to share more about that work. Before we get started, as always, I've just got some quick housekeeping and intro stuff to talk through about the Science Collaborative and this series. So the National Estuarine Research Reserve System is a national network of 30 unique research reserves as shown on this map. This is a NOAA program that works in collaboration with a local place-based partner, either a state agency, university, or nonprofit at each site. Each reserve site includes programs focused on the activities you can see on the screen, which include land stewardship, research and scientific monitoring, training programs for the public and local officials, and education. The Science Collaborative supports science for estuarine and coastal decision makers by coordinating regular funding opportunities and supporting user-driven collaborative research and transfer activities that address critical coastal management needs identified by the reserves. And the Collaborative Science for Estuaries series is a webinar series that features project teams supported by the NERRS Science Collaborative program staff and partners. Speakers share their unique approaches to addressing current coastal and estuarine management issues. And if that sounds interesting to you, please feel free to join us for future webinars about all these fun topics like today's. Before we get too much further into the webinar, I just have a quick note on informed consent. So these webinars are one of the things that we consider really valuable for helping us learn as a program. Insights from speakers and participants like you can help us understand better how we can improve the practice of collaborative science. For example, in the development of future workshops, webinars, or resources such as tools, tips, and case studies that we usually just include in our guide to collaborative science, which is open access. With that in mind, we want to inform attendees that any insights or feedback you share, for example, in the chat or via the webinar exit survey, may be used for program learning and development. Please note that if we capture a direct quote from you that we'd like to use for learning purposes, we will reach out to you ahead of time and seek permission and provide an explanation of its use. All those quotes would be used anonymously. Okay, lastly, all attendees are muted upon entry. We'll be handling questions via the Q&A feature on the webinar console you can see there. You can enter questions for the presenters as they occur to you throughout the webinar. In fact, we encourage it so that you don't forget them. And we'll plan to discuss as many as we can in the last chunk of the webinar today. The chat's visible to everyone, so you can use that to talk amongst yourselves and or ask organizers technical or support questions. And with that, I will introduce our speakers for today. Laura Farwell is the Coastal Wetlands Conservation and Science Coordinator for the Pacific Bird Habitat Joint Venture. Serena Vance is the Coastal Training and Engagement Coordinator at Kachemak Bay Reserve in Alaska. And Roger Fuller is the Natural Resources Coordinator at Padilla Bay Reserve in Washington.
Thanks, Laura, for taking care of slide sharing today. Hello, everyone, and Aloha Friday from Amy in the chat. My name is Sabrina Bentz, and as Nick said, I'm coming to you all from Kachemak Bay, Alaska. And to start out, I'd just love to share that our intention for today is to share about the learning and journey that we've been on, celebrating some tangible progress and acknowledging some challenges in this work. And how this project has catalyzed and contributes to refining the NERRS vision of resilient estuaries and coastal watersheds where human and natural communities thrive. I'd invite all of you to think about how our story can help catalyze new ways of thinking and doing that people in diverse roles, including reserve staff, cultural community partners, and broader coastal conservation and management communities connected to the NERRS system and beyond can consider in their own work. So before talking about the project specifics, I want to honor each of our community partners and Indigenous leaders that participated in the project for their thoughtfulness and generosity with their time and knowledge, especially the elders that participated in this work in our shared experience as we explored elevating the role of Indigenous knowledge in the NERRS conservation and beyond. This project engaged members of the Kanaka-Awiwi tribes of the Chugach region, Samish Indian Nation, Swinomish Indian Tribal Community, Coquille Indian Tribe, Confederated Tribes of the Coos, Lower Umpqua, and Siuslaw Indians, Northwest Indian College, and Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior Chippewa, Ojibwe, along with our staff and co-management partners at the He'eyaner and staff of Kachemak Bay, Padilla Bay, South Slough, and Lake Superior NERRS, and as our lovely and wonderful partners at Pacific Birds Habitat Joint Venture. So to introduce this neuroscience collaborative catalyst project, the title was Integrating Indigenous Knowledge and Neuroscience and Monitoring to Improve Estuarine Restoration and Management with Shared Benefits for Birds and Local Communities. And this was led by a project team of colleagues at Pacific Birds Habitat Joint Venture, Monica, Laura, and Helen, and representatives from each of the NERRS from Hawaii, Alaska, Oregon, and Washington. We have Kavika, Alice, Roger, and myself. And we led the design of the technical and collaborative approach of this project with input from and participation by our local community partners who all brought their expertise and their hearts to contribute to this work. I'm grateful to be introducing the project and background on behalf of the project team, and I acknowledge that how I present reflects my personal perspectives and great memories. We hope that several other team members and partners are on the webinar today, and we'll create space at the end for them to share their reflections as well. For a more complete picture of this project, I encourage everyone to visit the project page at the Neuroscience Collaborative and see the key takeaways report developed by our group. So to get into a little bit of the background, the idea for this project is built on the foundation of reciprocal relationships of people and place and inclusive co-creation of knowledge and understanding of best practices for weaving together Indigenous knowledge and conventional science. The NERRS provides a model of connection between Indigenous and conventional science for sustainable estuary, and I cannot overstate the importance of this model and the value that HEA brings to the NERRS system, leading by example through their designation process, management plan and needs, and intentional design of their programs and processes focused on biocultural restoration. This project idea was built on facilitated exchange with NERRS staff and their co-management partners through previous knowledge exchange projects on cultural ecosystem services among staff of the NERRS in Hawaii and Alaska. And I'm really grateful that these exchanges have influenced every dimension of the ways myself and my colleagues have worked as we recognize and reconnect to the threads of cultural relationships and ecological health in our NERRS. In addition to expressing the deepest gratitude to Kavika Winter and his staff, who are the technical lead on the project, I'd like to remember our former manager of Kachemak Bay, Kui Walker, and the former director of the Hawaii Institute of Marine Biology, Eleanor Sterling, and acknowledge their passion in enabling and encouraging the NERRS to invest in this work. To operationalize some of the approaches and practices that we were really excited about to connect Indigenous and conventional science and reserves that have different contexts across the whole NERRS system, this project aimed to expand learning and sharing to include more of our local community partners and Indigenous leaders and additional reserves in the Pacific region who were eager to address this topic as we were. We were lucky to engage with and build a relationship through mutual goals related to thriving coastal places with the Pacific Birds Habitat Joint Venture, who served as a connector to engage across a broader geography in the Pacific region with additional reserves, and our friends like Roger at Padilla Bay in Washington and in South Slough at Oregon. With this gathering of reserves, our local partners, and Pacific Birds, we explored our NERRS settings and a shared goal. In our NERRS, coastal wetlands provide essential habitats for migratory and threatened and endangered birds experiencing alarming global declines, many of which are culturally important to Indigenous people and local communities. The goal of the team was to facilitate collaborative information sharing and learning through the lens of biocultural restoration. To share with you the basis of biocultural restoration, I have the words of our technical lead from Kavika. Biocultural restoration focuses on restoring relationships between Indigenous people and their places, as well as between them and the biodiversity that shaped the language and identities of their ancestors. Biocultural restoration is built on the notion that everything in the system is interconnected, as are the problems we perceive and the solutions to them. For our team, the objectives of this one-year Catalyst project were collaborative information sharing and learning across the 4 sites in the Pacific region. Bonus that we got Lake Superior NERRS as well, with a common interest in elevating Indigenous knowledge and practices in stewardship of coastal wetlands. And secondly, to strengthen relationships among reserve staff, Indigenous communities, and other partners. And then before passing to Laura Farwell of Pacific Birds Habitat Joint Venture to dive into the technical and collaborative approaches, I'd like everyone to keep in mind the core principle of elevating the role of Indigenous knowledge and practices alongside conventional science, which leads to more effective and equitable resource management with shared benefits for birds and people.
Thanks so much, Sabrina, for that great overview of what led all of us to this collaboration in the first place and our intentions for this work and for our presentation today. So again, my name is Laura Farwell, and I'm the Conservation and Science Coordinator for Coastal Wetlands at Pacific Birds Habitat Joint Venture. And we're really fortunate in our service region that we overlap with such great national estuarine research reserves and partners. So I'm going to pivot now to focus a bit on some of the details of how this all looked in practice, how the workshop went, what led up to it, what followed, and some of the lessons that we learned along the way. As Sabrina mentioned, our project approach was really founded on the existing framework at HEAEA and previous methods that were developed through the Cultural Ecosystem Services work. But really our collaborative approach was in some ways very straightforward. We collectively agreed and acknowledged that the work needed to be relationship driven and process driven, rather than focused on end results or products. And this sounds pretty simple, but can be quite hard to wrap your brain around for a lot of us that are trained in conventional Western approaches to science and conservation, which tend to be pretty linear and focused on deliverables and outcomes. So I'll just say it again, the main outcome or deliverable of this one-year Catalyst project was the relationships. Other outcomes absolutely followed in terms of on-the-ground research and conservation and action, but none of that happens in this context without first taking time to build trust and relationships. And this just takes time and really clear intentions. So as a project team, we also developed and agreed upon collaborative priorities and goals for the project, benchmarks for progress, and we also scheduled a timeline for regular monthly check-ins where the group shared experiences and feedback that they were hearing from our Indigenous and local community partners. And the key point here is that we tried really hard to listen to that feedback and to really iteratively build it into our priorities and planning. We definitely made missteps and mistakes along the way. I think what saved us was that we were sincerely interested in learning from those mistakes and that we course corrected whenever possible. And that really in turn helped build those foundations of trust and strengthen the relationships with our community partners. Okay, so I won't bury the lead. At the end of the day, the process worked really well. And in the end, 41 participants traveled to Hawaii to participate in this workshop in what was described as the most diverse convening of Indigenous partners within the reserve system's history. Visiting participants included folks representing over 16 tribal nations and tribal entities, including 19 Indigenous participants visiting from regions in Alaska, Washington, and Oregon. And that's not counting Indigenous staff and participants from HEAEA. But there was a lot of work that led up to that and that followed the event that helped it succeed. So leading up to the workshop, staff and project team members reached out to Indigenous and local community partners in regions surrounding each of the participating reserves and really engaged in discussions about tribal interests and priorities, shared values and cultural and subsistence priorities, and just started gauging interest of partners in participating in a knowledge exchange like this. And I'll say that overwhelmingly, the feedback and response was positive. I will say the biggest barrier was probably time, that just all of these folks are really, really busy, and it's hard to get away for a week to do an in-person workshop. And so Offering honoraria and covering transportation costs and logistics really helped with some of those barriers, but in some cases it did prevent people that wanted to participate from joining. So it's something to keep in mind. We also held virtual orientations leading up to the event. First, to just introduce the project and sort of the overarching goals and objectives. And our technical lead, Kavika, offered some background context on the model, the co-management model at He'eia, and some of the background on the biocultural restoration practices. Closer to the date, we also held an orientation with more logistics, just to answer participant questions, to let them know what to expect, what the workshop was going to look like, accessibility issues and what to pack. And that really helped alleviate people's sort of anxiety and maybe nerves about what to expect coming into the workshop. And throughout the preparation process, we all as a team tried really hard to keep in mind the historical context of colonial knowledge appropriation and extractive science. We tried really hard to stress our commitment to honoring Indigenous knowledge and data sovereignty, but we also fully understood and expected there to be varying levels of response and trust, and that was okay. Okay, so once we were all there at the workshop approach itself was really interactive and intentionally multi-generational. And we tried hard to create a peer-to-peer learning environment. And I would be remiss if I didn't pause here to extend a huge heartfelt thanks to the reserve staff and community partners at He'eia. None of this would have happened without their hospitality and warmth and good humor in dealing with a workshop group this size. Just moving this many people around is really logistically challenging. And their expertise in sharing their knowledge with the visitors. He'eia staff and community partners did facilitate most of the gatherings and group sessions, and they really used facilitation methods that drew on a variety of approaches, many of them Indigenous practices that are inclusive of really diverse forms of expression, from storytelling to sharing ancestral songs and dances to other forms of cultural expression. Okay, I included the agenda for the workshop not to get into the nitty gritty. There is a QR code here if you'd like to know more. This will take you to our key takeaways report. But really, I just kind of wanted to give you a high level sense of what happened at the event and how we organized it. So you can see that Monday and Friday were travel days, and we did have a welcome event on Monday and a goodbye event on Friday. But the sort of core of the event happened in those 3 days in the middle. And each day we sort of scheduled group meals that were catered on site. And I mentioned this because that was really important. The shared meals and that sort of unstructured time to just sit and talk story with each other was where a lot of the magic happened, and that can't kind of be underestimated. After breakfast each day in the morning, we would start with a site visit around the He'eia watershed, where we would meet with partners and engage in service learning opportunities, or laulima, where participants would have a chance to get their hands and feet dirty and really experience the system and some of the biocultural restoration practices. After lunch in the afternoons, we had more facilitated discussions and presentations where He'eia staff and partners would present stories or research and answer questions of the visiting participants. In the last afternoon, we had a circle where visiting participants also had an opportunity to share their reflections and feedback. And then each evening we had dinner and celebrations and explorations of ancestral memory, which included sharing of ancestral and traditional songs and dance and foods and other cultural exchange. All right. So that was sort of the workshop and how it went at a very high level. Again, if you're interested in learning more, I encourage you to take a look at our project page or the key takeaways document. But I want to end by sharing some of the key sort of lessons learned and takeaways from the experience. And I want to emphasize here that these are not intended as a one-size-fits-all guidance for similar projects. And rather, we just really want to share our reflections in the hopes that some of you may find them useful, that it might inspire you to think about how this work could apply to some of your own work at your own organization. If you're thinking about organizing a similar event, we encourage you to reach out to the project team. Or if you're just interested in getting started where you're at, and we're all pretty friendly and pretty committed and passionate about this work. So I encourage you to reach out. Okay, so first I'm going to share some takeaways from the participants that we heard through follow-up conversations and feedback surveys. We got a lot of overwhelmingly positive responses where people left the workshop feeling really moved and inspired and hopeful. But there's a few key themes that we heard more than once and repeatedly. The first was that people really left with an understanding that reconnecting people with their lands, waters, and cultural practices can have cascading benefits for entire ecosystems and communities, from improving water quality and restoring wildlife habitats to renewing cultural traditions and healing from generational trauma. And that this work is good for people and it's good for conservation. This isn't mission drift and it's not tangential to the work we do. It's central to effective, equitable, and sustainable conservation. Participants also unanimously felt an increased sense and awareness of the reciprocal interconnected relationship between humans and nature. And many expressed the need to reflect deeply on this through a process of both learning and unlearning. This is nothing new to Indigenous folks, but for a lot of folks trained in traditional, conventional Western academic institutions, I can speak from my own experience that this sort of reciprocity and holism is not centered in the way that we train ecologists and conservationists. We heard that service learning projects were really important. Again, those opportunities to really get into the land, to get your hands dirty, to share those experiences and talk story and sharing meals and stories, all of that was really important to helping to build those trust relationships that really built a foundation for a lot of great work that came after the workshop. And lastly, the intergenerational participation and interactions among the elders, the middle generation, and the youth were really highly valued by participants throughout the workshop. There were elders, there were middle generations, there were young adults, teenagers, and there were parents with very small children, including a newborn. Serena was able to bring her baby with her. And family members also came and weren't just caregivers that were separate from the experience. Oftentimes they were taking part in the workshop activities. And this really communal feeling to the event really added a lot of value to it and is something that we don't often see in conventional conferences and workshops. Okay, and lastly, from an organizer's point of view, we can't emphasize enough the importance of co-developing your workshop from the beginning, including the priorities, your goals, the approaches, clarifying cultural norms and expectations, doing this early on and checking in often and not waiting until you have an idea half or fully baked before you come to your Indigenous partners is really important. Offer honoraria whenever possible. It really helps remove barriers and it's a really good way to recognize the respected cultural contributions and expertise of your Indigenous collaborators. It's important to be aware and of and acknowledge your own agencies and organizations' history in the specific context of relationships with participating tribes and Indigenous communities. We can talk more about this if people are interested, but it's just really important to do your homework and to understand what your own organization's history is in these contexts. It's important to avoid over-planning. We can't stress enough the importance of scheduling unstructured time. It's really tempting to want to pack everything that you can into these events. But again, a lot of the magic happened in the quiet moments when people had time to just talk and get to know each other. And lastly, we encourage people to just be realistic about how much it takes to put together an event like this and to be realistic when you're designing a budget for a request for funds for an event like this, that you budget adequate administrative funds. Okay. With that, I'm going to pass things over to Roger, who's going to dive into some of the implications for science and management and some of the next steps. You know, even though the project ended about a year ago, a lot of seeds that were planted continue to grow. So I'll hand things over to you, Roger.
All right. Thank you, Laura. Okay, there we go. So I'm Roger Fuller. I'm the Natural Resources Coordinator, the Stewardship Coordinator at the Padilla Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve, which is in the Central Salish Sea in Washington State. And I'm hailing from the lands and waters of the Coast Salish people and many of our local tribes here, including the Samish and the Swinomish, the Nuaha, the Upper Skagit, the Soxhawtla, the Stillaguamish, the Lummi, and the Northwest Indian College. We're all key partners. I want to provide a few examples from my perspective about implications of this work for science and management A lot of these are just, I think, how this workshop has helped to sort of shift the way that I think about and do conservation and research. And I'll mention some other things that a number of the different partners are working on. And then I'm hoping in the discussion we can kind of dive into some more specifics with a lot of the different partners. But from my perspective, I think one of the biggest effects of this project has been in helping us to think about reframing stewardship and research using a biocultural lens. And what that means for me personally is I have been trained as an ecologist, as a scientist in the sort of Western science tradition. My training really helped me understand ecosystems as really complex, interconnected, interactive systems, and their health and resilience and productivity are really directly related to the integrity of a myriad of a whole bunch of interactions happening among all the different species, from bacteria and fungi to algae, diatoms, plants, all the animals involved in the systems, including humans. And I was also trained in the ideas of ecosystem services, that ecosystems produce really key services and products for humans, and that the whole human economy, as well as our quality of life, is really dependent on healthy functioning ecosystems around us. So that's kind of my professional background. But as a professional scientist and a restoration practitioner, I've always kind of focused my work on restoring the non-human components of ecosystems, despite the fact that usually the cause of the need for restoration has almost always been unconsidered and poorly informed actions of our own species in those ecosystems. So biocultural restoration, we learned from our workshop, is really rooted in the idea that places, habitats, species, humans, and ecosystems have a long integrated history, and that research and restoration of those systems, by definition, needs to include restoration of the whole system, including those deep human connections to the systems. None of the ecosystems that we currently manage existed without the direct integration of humans as members of the systems and as direct stewards of the systems. So just as an example, I'm working on a tidal marsh restoration project here in the Padilla Bay NERR, and it's at a site that was adjacent to a large Samish Indian village. And it's a site that has a lot of documented use, resource harvest, documented habitat stewardship, and a site of real cultural significance and importance that extends back for centuries, if not more. And so restoration there needs to sort of acknowledge this very long history and include a restoration of those cultural connections to the site and the integration of a long history of Indigenous knowledge about stewarding those kinds of resources in that particular site. Knowledge that was developed over a much longer time frame than Western knowledge and science has been present at the site. But one thing I think that the workshop really helped me understand much more deeply is that biocultural restoration isn't just about restoring Indigenous connections with these places and history and current stewardship of these places, but it's about restoring all human community connections with our habitats and species as well. So we're at a place in history, I think, where in our Western society, people are distancing themselves more and more from nature and from their sense of connections with ecosystems. And I think that habitat restoration really needs to rebuild not just habitats, but people's connections to those habitats. Restoration is needed not because habitats became degraded all on their own, but because we degraded them as a result of our lost connections with habitats and a lost sense of why they're important to us. So I feel and I've learned that restoring these habitats without restoring the human connections with them is restoration that really doesn't address the root of the problem. And I think this is really true for restoration and also for research and all the other things that we do in the context of managing and studying and living in these coastal resources where we are. In terms of thinking about how to do this, in practical terms, it can be easy to address them, at least at a conceptual level, by building in community and volunteer engagement deeply into all of the work we do, all of the research, as well as the restoration, stewardship, and education components that we do in the places where we live and work. And we can do this in a ways to help the community and the people who live here really become immersed in the idea that they are the stewards of these habitats and places, that they develop that sense of gratitude for the things that these places provide, and in terms of their own sense of place and their own quality of life. But sometimes it's hard to figure out how to do this, how to take a sort of a biocultural approach to projects. So I've been involved in a number of large tidal marsh restoration projects, and it's always about the experts and the professionals in doing these projects. It's about the hydraulic modelers and the ecosystem scientists figuring out what's going on, and the engineers who need to be able to design large infrastructure projects, and the drivers and the mechanics of GPS-enabled huge earth-moving equipment to move stuff around. And the projects rarely seem to include the local community in a significant capacity, other than inviting them to a few meetings about the project or something. And so it's become I don't know, something I'm trying to spend a lot more time on in terms of understanding how to reframe big restoration projects to be focused on biocultural restoration. How do we center that full human biological system for restoration? And it means really substantially rethinking and reframing how we do restoration so that communities see the habitats and their stewardship of them as their responsibility, not something that only those experts and professionals over there are going to take care of. It's something that every member of the community needs to be involved in. And I think that without sort of a broad societal support for and engagement in habitat stewardship, we are just going to continue to battle to save and restore these remnants of habitats, and we'll continue to watch species decline and blip off the screen. So another implication for science and management is this idea of co-development, of co-developing different kinds of projects and priorities and policies and so on. I think that we at the National Reserves have generally done a pretty good job of interacting and partnering with universities and local stakeholder groups in our areas to develop our management plans and our projects. But most of us, I think, have done a pretty poor job of including the people who have the sort of longest history in our places, and often the deepest knowledge of the species and the habitats that we steward and that we're part of. So changing this means engaging with our Indigenous partners at a pretty fundamental level in decision making, at a level to better understand the biocultural context for these places that we steward and manage, and really kind of embedding those ideas in every aspect of what we do. Just some examples with research needs, for example, we're looking at things like phenology of migratory birds and their use of different habitats in the coastal zone. And there's, a fair amount of recent sort of conventional monitoring data and information that can go into that. But many Indigenous groups have a centuries, and even more longer time of interacting with these same species and places, of understanding changes in phenology, changes in patterns, changes in species. And we need to do a much better job at integrating these ideas and Indigenous knowledge and Western science approaches to have a better, fuller understanding of what's going on. So there's a lot of different ways that different NERRS and partners are kind of working on co-developing different aspects of the work that we do, and we can dive into those in the discussion later. Go ahead and next slide. Another aspect in terms of implications for science and management, I think, is in training and education. So this photo here shows our group joining a Laulima event or a stewardship event there in Heia, and something that almost it's something that happens almost daily in Heia in terms of events happening at partner sites throughout the Heia community. And it always begins with the group pausing to remember and to learn not just what they're about to do, but also why. They learn about the centuries of biocultural history at the site, about the key ways that habitat at the site supports local plants and animals and humans, and about the importance and the responsibility of the local human community as habitat stewards. And then the meetings always also include a focus on gratitude for the gifts of of nature in that area, of the habitats and species that we're working with, and gratitude for each other as co-stewards. And I think that these kinds of elements are very often missing from the way that we teach and train people about habitats. And we have a lot to learn from our Indigenous partners about training and education. So this slide just lists a few of the steps that we're starting to take, including co-developing internships, building teacher training that is based on a foundation of cultural knowledge, and elevating Indigenous expertise in a lot of those different ways that we train and engage in communities. Next slide. Finally, I'd like to just mention a few of the next steps that some of the partners involved are taking. There are Laulima, the idea of doing lots of field collaborations with partners and community groups is something that I think a lot of us are taking on, doing direct collaborations to get people engaged in research and field work and restoration and stewardship of their local resources. There's a lot of grant proposals that are in progress that have developed from these different collaborations, focusing on migratory birds, fire as a cultural and ecological tool, general biocultural restoration ideas, capacity building, some work on habitat restoration, and the understanding that a lot of these habitats have species that are first foods, and that the knowledge around those species and the integration of them in restoration is really key, not just for ecological outcomes, but for restoring those biocultural connections with the resources. I think there's a lot we need to do in terms of elevating biocultural restoration. So that phrase biocultural restoration is something that is new to most of us, that very few people, I think, can describe what it means to them or to what they do. And I feel like it's something that should be really at the core of a lot of what we do. And so it's something that we need to integrate every time that we're talking about research and restoration, integrate into our conversations, our communications that we do. So there's a lot of different ways that we're working on different ways to begin to integrate Indigenous knowledge and conventional knowledge and monitoring methods into what we do. A lot of the project partners are working on different elements, and I'm hoping that we can dive into some of them in the discussion that follows here. And so I would just like to end by expressing my gratitude to Kavika Winter and the whole team at Heia and the community partners there and the elders who shared their knowledge and their experience with these ideas and really helped to, I think, advance a lot of partnerships across all of the Western region here and Lake Superior area, and with the inspiration from how they've been approaching the work. So thank you, Kavika and partners. Okay. Thank you for your interest in these topics. I think we'll have time for some good discussion. And there's a number of partners who were involved in this project who I think are on the line here. And so I'd like to first kind of open it up and invite folks who were involved in this project to chime in with their thoughts about the project or the next steps that they're involved in terms of applying what we learned and experienced through this project. Thank you.
Thanks, folks. I'm going to go ahead and put us in gallery view. And echoing Roger, if there are folks on the project team that'd like to speak up too on their experiences, you can raise your hand and I'll be able to see you and I can unmute you. Folks can also put their questions into the chat or the Q&A if they have any for the presenters, and we'll just start logging them over here and walk through them. Don't be shy. I know it's Friday and, folks are at the end of their week, but this is a good place to have a conversation. I think it's a good way to end the week, personally. So if you have questions, feel free to ask. See someone with a raised hand. Okay, Catherine, I'm gonna go ahead and unmute you. You should be able to come off mute now.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks everyone for the presentations and sharing. I really appreciate it, and it was a very meaningful project to be a part of. And I just wanted to chime in as the manager of the Ketchimek Bay Research Reserve that there were some key relationships that formed over that informal time during lunches with our local Alaska regional tribal representatives that led to some collaborative proposal writing on restoration projects, some site visits to tribal communities to better understand what their priorities are, and then thoughtful discussion about the role the research reserve might be able to play in supporting that. So, for instance, there is a historic cannery and dock that is eroding a potential hazardous site in one of the villages, and we collaboratively wrote a proposal to restore that site and not just remove the hazardous waste, but also monitor what's important to the community. So the shellfish populations, the substrate, the water quality, and the other concerns around fresh water. And that proposal was not funded, but the relationship building started, the conversation started, and there's trust that's being built, which is really meaningful. And then alongside that, we worked closely with our community council, which is a network of volunteers that advises the Ketchimek Bay Research Reserve to make sure that our project priorities and our management plan is grounded in community needs. And we've worked very hard in the last 18 months to increase the diversity of people who are part of that community council, and also formally reach out to the tribes of the region. We have a really great network of informal relationships, always room to improve that, of course, but it took some educating and discussion and effort with our community council members to understand the importance and value of the Research Reserve Community Council officially reaching out to the tribal council as a form of respect and to establish a better relationship, or at least and acknowledge that the Research Reserve was established without consultation, or a lowercase consultation, I should say. So without the local tribes and Indigenous people informing what a research reserve should look like and how it should be structured. So I'll pause there, but it was a great catalyst for a lot of effort at the Ketchimek Bay Research Reserve.
Thanks, Catherine. Other folks, if you do have things you want to add to, feel free to join in. I did see a question come in the Q&A as well. Someone wanted to know more about how many tribal members were participating from each locality, and I think they added referring to registrants. I think that's maybe referring to one of your workshops. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just sharing a summary from our key takeaways document that we shared during the presentation, with a more specific summary of who exactly came to the workshop. But yeah, there were 41 participants, 24 of whom represented over 16 tribal nations and entities. So you can see from the Chugach region, which is the region surrounding the Ketchimek Bay Reserve. There were representatives of a tribally led organization called the Chugach Regional Resources Commission. And then there were also registrants that represented these 5 tribes, the village of Nanwalek, Port Graham, Chiniga, Eyak, and Seldovia Village. From the Salish Sea region around Padilla Bay Research Reserve in Washington, you can see the list of representatives, and you'll see that not all of those are local to the Salish Sea, Coast Salish region, but some of them are faculty at the Northwest Indian College who represented other indigenous groups in North America. And then from the Coos Bay region of Oregon, it was primarily partners from the Coquel tribe and the confederated tribes of Coos, Lower Umpqua, and Siuslaw Indians. And then we did have that bonus reserve come from Lake Superior, and we had a wonderful elder from the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa or Ojibwe. Does that answer your question?
I think that was a chatted question, so you can feel free to chat us whether you still have follow-up questions or not, or raise your hand if you want to elaborate. In the meantime, we can ask another question because there's a few coming in now. Laura shared some examples. If you could do this type of gathering again across reserves with Indigenous partners, could you expand a little bit more on if there were any small or big things you would do differently, personally or as a group?
I don't know. I mean, we made a lot of mistakes, and I think that's important to be transparent about. We had a lot of good intentions. We decided to start where we were, knowing that we all had a lot to learn, and we had really great guidance from our technical lead in Kavika Winter and the other staff at He'eia. I don't know that I would do anything differently, though, even though we made mistakes, because I think, it's really important to start where you're at. It's really easy to get paralyzed in this work out of fear of doing something wrong. I know that might not be a very specific answer, but I do think it's important to just do your homework, do your best, make sure you're asking for guidance and correcting and apologizing when you do make missteps. But I'm curious to hear if Roger or Sabrina or any of the other participants have thoughts on this one.
I don't know that I have anything really specific. I think the thing that is perhaps always a challenge is just the time available to be thorough in outreach and connecting with partners. It's hard to do sometimes on a small project timeline or short project timeline. And it just kind of points, I think, to me to a really key learning, which to me is that these kinds of projects and processes are based on long-term relationships. And it takes a long time to develop those relationships, to develop the trust and to act on them. And that's okay. So it just understanding and acknowledging that at the beginning that this is a long-term process and that you are engaging in that long-term process. It's not a 1-year funded project and then you're done. It begins long before you do the project. It lasts long after you do the project. And as Laura said, you start where you are and you just move ahead, stumble ahead, make mistakes, and learn and laugh with each other as you go. And it somehow works out wonderfully in the end. I don't know how, but
I can also just add a reflection. This is a little bit related to could you do something differently? And also thinking about the question prior about the representation or participation by tribal partners in our region. And we're really fortunate and lucky to have a relationship with a regional tribal nonprofit entity. So Alaska has a complicated landscape of Alaska Native entities between regional nonprofits, regional corporations, village corporations, federally recognized tribes, and non-federally recognized tribes. And so I think an advice, or if I was going to do, or the next time we do something like this, I would say doing even more homework and understanding um, leadership and structure and protocol for each of those different types of entities is really important. We, as I mentioned, we're so lucky to be partnered and work well with the regional tribal nonprofit focused on um, cultural resources and environmental resources. And so they were a huge partner as far as identifying elders and knowledge bearers and creating those invitations to invite participants and participate themselves in this workshop. So I think that, yeah, both building on participation, representation, and then something to think about even more intentionally in the future is making sure that you are reaching out and talking to all of the folks who should and could be involved in the work.
Those are really helpful insights. We have lots of questions coming in, so let's see how many we can fly through here in the last few minutes. All right, so I'll post the next one. I'm in a region wherein our tribal communities are already doing their own work to manage and decolonize their environments. Our NER is still in the process of designation, but I'm wondering what the NER has to offer tribal partners. I'm getting a lot of so what when I'm trying to build our tribal partnerships, and I need to know how to frame NER involvement in a useful way. That is fascinating.
I can provide one answer that I kind of think about. And in our region, our tribes have long been and are still deeply involved in stewardship and research and restoration kinds of projects in our area. They also tend to be have limited capacity in terms of staff to engage with the large number of agencies and people and community groups who want to engage with them. And so it's a big struggle, I think, on their part to sort of deal with all of that interest. So I think a approach that I try to do with my work is to, in conversations with them, to understand where they are limited in capacity, where they would like additional capacity, and how I can help to support that. So rather than asking them to engage with me, for example, we just were helping one of our tribal partners with trapping for invasive European green crabs in the neighboring bay a couple weeks ago. And that's an area where they have an area that's not within the reserve footprint. We do a lot of invasive green crab trapping because we have them, they're a recent invader in the Salish Sea. And so this is right now a really big issue for everybody here. So we have capacity, we have equipment, we have trained people who can help with that. And so when there's that opportunity, we say, hey, let's come and we can help with trapping. So just looking for those kinds of things where they could use additional capacity and stepping in and providing that and helping in any way that advances their own ecological and biocultural restoration needs and stewardship needs. So I think that's really key, is understanding that they don't have capacity to engage with everybody. And so how can you contribute to their needs as a National Estuarine Research Reserve focused on similar needs in terms of coastal resource management?
I'm going to quickly hop on behind Roger on that and just it as this person is going into a new process of designation. Each reserve is a state, federal, local partnership. So our federal language is the NOAA language, and our state language is either a university, like an academic language, or a state management or conservation language. So I say the reserves can be somewhat of a bridge sometimes if there are administrative burdens to any of those federal or state systems. And so that's just another way that thinking about the NERRS as a place to streamline or ease some of the processes that tribal organizations may have had difficulty or barriers with or systemic barriers in the past.
Laura, anything you want to add? It's okay if not. Okay. I see Lauren has her hand raised, so I'm going to go ahead and unmute and allow her to ask her question or comment. I don't know what it is.
Okay, sorry. I apologize. This actually isn't Lauren. This is Ingrid Harold from the
Oh, hey, Ingrid.
Kachemak Bay Research Reserve. Must be using Lauren's computer.
All good.
I just wanted to thank everyone for this talk. It's been really great to revisit this experience. I'm the education coordinator at the Kachemak Bay Research Reserve, and I wanted to just add a little bit to the last answer to the question and then talk about my experience and how it's helped my education program. I think one of the things that we're finding at Kachemak Bay Research Reserve with our tribal partners and building relationships is that to keep reminding ourselves that our our interactions with partners don't have to be transactional. You don't have to be giving something or getting something. They can be just sense of place experiences together. And that itself is valuable. And then I also think, especially with some of our history with different tribal areas, to respect the fact that sometimes a tribe doesn't want to work with you or have a relationship with you because of some past experiences, and that's totally okay and valid. And so that to respect those boundaries and to timing is everything, and maybe at a different time with different people, those relationships can grow. So that's just what I would add to that question. And then I did want to say, just touch base about the education portion and how this experience impacted me and how I educate. One of the things that Roger was talking about is that sense of place, which is one of my foundations of my education, but also looking at sense of place and the human components that are contributed into sense of place. And we have in the past had struggles with teachers feeling that they have enough knowledge to teach about the history of sense of place and the cultural knowledge. And this is a really nice lens to help them feel empowered to tell the story of a place, because you're talking about the human components of an ecosystem. And just like you were talking about Western science, traditional Western education breaks things out. You have social sciences and history, and then you have, biology. And so to be able to incorporate those all together and empower teachers to do that is one of the things that I walked away with and has been really enlightening to me and a great direction for my education program. The other thing is, with these relationships, being able to approach ideas that we've all been thinking about but didn't have the right path to. Both Sabrina and Roger mentioned the co-developing of internships, and so how you work collaboratively with internships in rural areas that you don't live in, and how to do that in a way that everybody feels is beneficial to the community. And that has been a process of learning, but I don't think I would have felt comfortable even starting it without having the foundation from this process that was provided through the Science Collaborative. And then especially the teacher trainings that we do at the Research Reserve, we've done little bits and pieces of incorporating traditional and cultural knowledge into them. But through this experience, we are being able to co-design a teacher training that will have the Chugach full cultural day-long training, and then teacher training on the sciences that we do and how those can be co-integrated into education, which is something that I am just so excited and I know is so needed in our communities. And so I'm really grateful. This has changed the way I see and direct my education program. So I just wanted to say that. Thank you.
Thanks, Ingrid. I see we are out of time. We had a couple questions that didn't get answered in session. So what we might do is just pitch those to the speakers on the way out. I should clarify that. I'll email them to the speakers, and we'll include the answers written out in the slides that we'll post after the presentation. So you can check back either Monday or even possibly later today, depending on how fast it takes us to how fast we can get that posted. But yeah, we'll make sure they get answered in the after the fact. If you have other questions that occur to you after the fact as well, you can put them in the exit survey. It'll launch automatically as soon as you leave the session. You'll also get a reminder email automatically tomorrow, which you hopefully will not look at until you're actually working. But they go out automatically, so a day after the fact. Big thank you to their speakers for sharing everything with us today. I always love hearing insights and takeaways for this kind of work. It's really helpful and important for us to think about. Thank you all for asking questions too. An engaged Q&A is a fun Q&A, so thank you for that and for everyone offering feedback. If you are looking for the recording, usually it'll be, like I said, within 1 or 2 days. So again, just big thank you to everybody, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day and their weekend.
Thank you, Nick, and the Science Collaborative. Thanks for inviting us.
Of course.
Yes, thank you.
You all.